Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
One of the most surprising incidents in the Old Testament involving animals must surely be the story of the talking donkey. I think the only other time I've come across a talking donkey is in Shrek. But what's this story all about, Mike?
Well, I'm not going to try and do the accent from the talking donkey in Shrek. That's one thing for sure. So yes, we absolutely are going to be looking at a talking donkey today in Numbers 22 to 24, which of course is proof of the Bible just being a whole bunch of children's fairy stories, isn't it? No, it isn't. This sort of thing is incredibly exceptional in the Bible, incredibly unusual. And as we'll see as we get into the story, there's a reason for why this thing happens here once, only once, never repeated. And there's a particular powerful reason that we'll see for why it's recorded here.
Well, we also like just to get the backstory, a bit of context. So at what point in the story of the people of Israel is this happening?
Well, just to recap, God's people have left their slavery in Egypt. God has freed them under the leadership of Moses. They've crossed the Red Sea. They've traveled south to Mount Sinai, and there God made them his people, gave them his law, told them to create the tabernacle as a place of worship. They then headed up north towards the promised land, and that whole process has taken them some 40 years, and they're now coming towards the end of that 40 years. But in order to reach Canaan, the promised land, they need to pass through two nations. They need to pass through, first of all, the land of Edom, and one of the kings of what's called the Amorites had refused to allow them permission to pass through peaceably. And so Israel had to fight back and had defeated them, as we read about in Numbers chapter 21. And now the next nation that they need to pass through, again, all they want to do is pass through peaceably on the way to the promised land. But now the next nation, Moab, and its king, King Balak, has become really fearful of this passing people. Now, remember, we've said in previous episodes, there's something like 2 to 2.5 million of them. So the thought of that number of people passing through your land and possibly turning against you could obviously be quite frightening. And so as we open chapter 22 of Numbers, we find that as they hear about what Israel ended up doing to Edom, they are terrified.
These are the Moabites.
These are the Moabites. And we read that Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. And they're really concerned that these people are going to attack them. They don't want to do that. They simply want to be able to pass through. So they need a solution for what to do against this huge number of people whom they are fearful may now attack them.
Are the Moabites essentially enemies of the Israelites?
Well, actually, they were what we might call extended family. Moab is a country just to the east and southeast of the Dead Sea, with Ammon to its north and Edom to its south. And the Moabites were actually related because Moab, obviously the founder of the Moabites, was the grandson of Lot. And Lot, you'll remember, was the nephew of Abraham. So this is wider extended family. So there ought to have been at least some cordial relationships between the two. But we find throughout most of the Old Testament period, they're often in conflict with one another, particularly over the very fertile land that lay to the north of Moab. So really, it should not have been difficult. This was very extended family. They ought to have at least been on nodding acquaintance. But in fact, they were generally at odds with one another.
And the point is that this large group of Israelites, as we'll call them, millions of them, in fact, couldn't just march through the land of Moab. They had to sort of ask permission, really.
Yeah, or otherwise it would have just looked like invasion, wouldn't it? And that's what they'd done in Edom, by the way, in the previous chapter, they'd asked permission to go through. They'd said, look, we won't take anything. If we need food and water, we'll pay for everything that we have to use. And they'd refuse. So yeah, I think we can understand, the potential threat of such a large group of people saying they want to pass through your territory, supposing they change their mind, and attacked you instead. So perhaps we can understand the fear and the uncertainty that there was.
So as recorded in Numbers, you say chapter 22, this is the king of Moab wanting to know what to do.
Yes, and so what he does is he thinks he needs some help from God or the gods that he worships. And so what he decides to do is he sends for one of the world famous prophets or diviners to come and give him some wisdom. So that's how the story starts. He sends a message to this guy called Balaam, and he sends some of his messengers, some of his elders to go from Moab, taking with them, we note, the fee for divination.
He's a sort of pagan consultant.
He's a pagan consultant, and like most consultants, he's going to be paid a ridiculous fee for what he does. Apologies to all the consultants listening out there. So he's a professional prophet. He's a paid prophet. And of course, the minute you start paying prophets, what are you going to get? Well, you're going to get the sort of prophecy that you've paid for. That's why it's so important, by the way, that Christian prophecy should never be paid for. I would and have never even accepted any gifts from anyone as a thank you for giving them a work for the Lord, because it simply colours what you hear. If you were to say to me, Mike, I'll give you £10,000 to go and seek God for me and bring me back a word for the Lord. I know what's going to happen. I'm going to bring a really good word for you, aren't I, David? Because there's money at stake, and money colours our hearing from the Lord.
But that went on then.
Absolutely. Now, remember, this is not within Israel. This is outside of Israel. So this is not the people of God. This is a non-Israelite group of people that is looking for guidance from God. So he sends off his elders with the fee for divination, approaches this internationally renowned prophet called Balaam, who says, okay, stay overnight. I'll seek the answer that the Lord gives me. And during that night, we get the first surprise of the story. And it's a surprise for Balaam because the living God actually speaks to him. Now, I think that was probably, in a sense, quite a shock. He'd been used to consulting all sorts of gods and spirits, and he's getting obviously therefore into the occult realm. And suddenly the living God breaks in and speaks to him and tells him not to go, tells him not to curse the people that he has blessed. And I think that would have been a huge shock, in the same way that it was a shock for the witch of Endor, who is approached by King Saul at a later period in Israel's history. Saul has got so desperate. He's so hardened his heart and so turned away from God that God isn't speaking to him anymore. And so he thinks the only thing I can do is go to a witch, which was clearly forbidden in the law. And so he disguises himself, goes to see this witch, and the witch says, well, don't you know that, this sort of thing's been forbidden in the land? And he says, yeah, but, the king will never hear, and I'll pay you good money. And so she seeks to summon up a spirit, and it's clear she's terrified when God allows the spirit of the prophet Samuel to appear. In other words, she encounters something real. She'd always dealt with the fake. And I think that probably is what happened here as well. So it was probably a huge surprise when God actually speaks to him, says, don't go. And so he tells the messengers, look, I won't go back. So they go back to the king of Moab and then return with even stronger pleas. And here's the thing that clinches it, offers of even more rewards for him. And perhaps surprisingly to us, though God is going to use this, God does tell him to go this time. He's actually said to them, I can't go beyond anything that God tells me, but agrees to go. And we read that night God came to Balaam and said, since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you. So I'll give you permission to go now, but you're only to say what I say, not what you're paid to say, not what would be financially fruitful to say. And so, surprise number one, God has spoken to this pagan prophet. He's had a real encounter with the living God, but has been told very clearly only to say what God gives him.
So he's not responding to the bribe, and probably the king thinks he's been successful in offering the bride.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the king is thinking, oh, yes, he's probably jumping for joy, because do remember, this is a guy of what we would say international renown. He is the lead number one prophet that you would want at your business conference or your church conferences. So the king, King Balak, thinks this is it. We have got the bee's knees coming. Now we will get a good word from this guy. Our situation will be resolved.
So how does the story unfold?
Well, Balaam makes the journey to Moab along with the elders who've been sent to him. But the thing is, it seems like although God had told him only to say what he was given to say, that actually in his heart was still the thought of all that money. And it seems like he was going with an intention to really perhaps skew things and earn that money after all. So surprise number two for him in this story. Surprise one was that God had spoken to him. The living God had really spoken. Surprise number two is that God really knows what's in Balaam's heart and challenges him on the way. And we get this really strange incident where our talking donkey is going to turn up in a moment, because we read something that looks like it's one of those supposed contradictions in the Bible. In verse 21 and 22, we read this, that Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the princes of Moab, but God was very angry when he went. You think, hang on.
He told him to go.
Yeah, he's just told him to go the night before. Now he's very angry with him. This must surely be one of these proofs that the Bible is full of contradictions, old wives' tales, a bit tucked from here, a bit taken from there, stuck together, and no one actually noticed the contradiction. Well, that's not the case at all. I think as we read on in the story, it becomes clear that God has seen in his heart, and the reason he is resisting him now, and the reason he's angry with him, is not that he's going, but that he's going for the wrong reason. And so he sends this angel to block the way of the donkey. And we get a number of, it's really farcical. It's a really funny story.
Because this is Balaam riding on a donkey along a road, and God sends an angel to block his way.
Yeah. And the funny thing is here is the donkey sees the angel and the world-renowned prophet can't see him. Now, there's the irony of the story. This is the greatest prophet supposedly the world has ever known. People pay him a fortune to bring him words from God.
And in the spiritual realm, he couldn't see anything.
He couldn't see a thing. He couldn't see what a donkey sees. So here is God. This is why the donkey appears. The donkey reputationally is supposed to be slow and stupid and stubborn, isn't it? I'm not sure they always are. They certainly can be stubborn. But it's like God is taking what is reputationally one of the dumbest of animals and showing the donkey what the supposed world's greatest prophet cannot see and hear. So this donkey is on his way, sees this angel, blocking the way. And this angel, by the way, we're told, has got a sword drawn in his hand. So this is a pretty fearsome sight that he's seeing. So the first thing that happens is we read that the donkey turns off the road, obviously to try and get away from this figure. And what does Balaam do? He doesn't see it, so he beats the donkey to get it back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stands in a narrow path between two vineyards. I think we've got to imagine two stone walls here separating the vineyards, narrow path between it. The donkey's got to get between. But when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. She's trying to get around this donkey because he's wanting her to go on. So he beat her again. And then the angel of the Lord moves on ahead, stands in a narrow place where there's no room to turn either this side or that side. And then when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, this time, the third thing she does is she lays down under Balaam. So she just goes down on all fours and he's left sort of sitting there squatting on top of the donkey. And he beats her again. So 3 times here, the donkey has seen what the world's supposed greatest prophet cannot see. And it's at that point that something incredibly surprising in this story happens. The donkey speaks to Balaam. We read these words, "The Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and she said to Balaam, 'What have I done to you to make you beat me 3 times?'" Perhaps even more surprising is that Balaam answered the donkey, "You've made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now." The donkey goes on to say, "Come on, am I not your donkey, which you've always ridden? Have I done this sort of thing before? I've always been obedient, haven't I?" "Well, yeah, you have." And then verse 31, "The Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn, and he bowed low and fell face down." So, talking donkey,
It's incredible.
what do we make of that? Well, look, either Balaam thought the donkey was talking and God so moved in his heart that he had this vision of the donkey talking, or quite simply, a miracle happened. It never happens again anywhere else in the Bible, anything like this. This is incredibly unusual. So whichever it is, the whole point of it is a dumb animal like a donkey can see what the supposed world's greatest prophet cannot see. There is the irony of this story. And it's only when, notice, the Lord opened Balaam's eyes. He couldn't see it himself. It wasn't until God broke into his life. Just as today, none of us can understand spiritual things. Maybe someone's been looking at Jesus, thinking about Jesus, and yet not making the breakthrough. Listen, what you need to pray for is for God to open your eyes, because until God opens your eyes, you'll just be looking at the Bible as stories, Jesus as a figure, his teaching as interesting. But if you've been trying to find the living God, please, one of the prayers you should pray is, "God, please open my eyes," because without you opening my eyes, my spiritual eyes, my inner eyes, I just can't see. And the prophet here couldn't see until God had done that for him.
So we've got to be careful how much emphasis we put on the fact that the donkey talked.
Yes, I wouldn't want to explain it away. It's there, it happened. And if you take all the miracles out of the Bible, you've got a very thin Bible. Certainly the greatest miracle of all, God raising his son Jesus from the dead, the Bible tells us you take that miracle out and you are left with no Christianity and no hope of salvation. So I wouldn't want to take it out. It's there, it's real, but I would be the first to say it is exceedingly unusual. This is not the sort of normal thing that happens. But remember, this is in a period of Israel's life when some incredible miracles will happen within that 40-year period that Israel will never claim happens again. They will never claim again that manna fell from heaven. And provide it for them for those 40 years. They'll never claim again that there was a donkey that talked. These are exceptional miracles for exceptional times, and they're not consistently repeated throughout the Bible.
We can't say that no animal was hurt during the telling of this story, because it's sad to hear about the beating of that donkey. But the point is, how did Balaam respond then? What did Balaam do?
Well, God challenges him, first of all, because there's still a heart issue. All that's happened at the moment is he's suddenly realized that God, the living God, has sent his angel in front of him. And so there's a bit of a challenge that follows, because the angel then asks him, why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. Now, that's interesting, because that really looks like the old money thing did lay behind this after all. It looks like Balaam really had said, yes, God, I will go and only tell what you tell me, brackets, but I can probably put a spin on it, can't I, so I can still make that fabulous amount of money that I've been promised for my consultation fee. So clearly, in his heart, there's an issue here still. The money was still a big thing. The angel goes on to say, the donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If she had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared her. And Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned. There's the words God is always looking for, an acknowledgement that we were wrong. I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if you are pleased, I will go back. And at that point, the angel says, no, I do want you to carry on. God wants you to continue with this journey, but let me underline again, you are only to speak what God gives you to speak and not what you have been paid to bring.
So the question is that what he does?
Well, he certainly does, because in chapters 23 and 24 of Numbers, he's invited 4 times by the king of Moab to curse Israel. So that's what he wants. Curse is the opposite of blessing. And the last thing that Balak, king of Moab, wants is for Israel to be blessed. He wants a curse brought down on them. What it was, we don't know, but a curse that they all die or get sickness or whatever it might be. So he has brought Balaam to curse the Israelites. But here's the interesting thing. Every time Balaam opens his mouth to prophesy, he cannot curse Israel. All he can do every time is bless them. So now we're getting genuine prophecy coming out of his mouth, prophecy brought about by the Holy Spirit. And every single time there is blessing and not curse. And the incredible thing is that some of the words that he speaks will turn out to be incredibly prophetic for both Israel and for Israel's Messiah. I mean, for example, if I just pick 2 or 3 examples out here from the prophecies, in his first speech, he says, how can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom God has not denounced? So that sets the context for what he is going to do. In his second speech, there's this word that actually Christians will often use still to this day. He says, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he not speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? A word that Christians will often use today to say that every promise of God is true. It comes to pass. Every prophetic word of God is true. It comes to pass. He fulfills what he says. But let's never forget those words came from the mouth of a pagan prophet that God was using at that point. In chapter 24 and verse 9, he says, may those who bless you be blessed and those who curse you be cursed. He's speaking over Israel here. Wow. That is really powerful, and it's still something that has happened to this day. Wherever nations have blessed Israel or helped them, they have found God has ended up blessing them. Wherever they've cursed them or worked against them, they've found God working against them. But perhaps the most powerful one of all is in his fourth prophetic word that he speaks in chapter 24, where he talks about seeing a vision from the Almighty. And he says these words, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. Who's he talking about? A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel, and he will crush the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of all the sons of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong, and a ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. My goodness, a star will come out of Jacob, a scepter rise from Israel. He is looking ahead there to the Messiah who would one day come, whom Christians now know to be Jesus. So here is this pagan prophet who's now agreed to say only what God gives him to say, and who ends up prophesying not only blessing over Israel, much to the annoyance of the king, by the way, who after each one says, no, you know, what have I paid you for? Didn't I tell you to speak a curse over them? But every time he speaks blessing and even ends up prophesying the coming of Messiah. Wow, what an amazing story.
And after all that, what happened? Where did he go?
Well, after all of that, he, quotes, got up and returned home, and Balak went his own way.
Oh.
He goes back, he goes off the scene, and that's the last that we hear of this guy. By the way, this is not a made-up story, despite its unusual elements in the story, because in 1967, archaeologists were digging in the plains of Moab, and they came across an ancient inscription carved in stone. And on it, there's a reference to, quotes, Balaam, son of Beor, the divine seer. In other words, this really was a historical figure. There's external evidence to prove it. So this incident really did happen, surprising as it all seems. You know, it was a surprise without doubt for Balaam, who finds that God speaks to him after all, after years of his made-up prophecies. The living God breaks into his life. It was a surprise for King Balak, who paid him to curse Israel and finds only blessing coming out of his mouth. I think it was probably a surprise for the Israelites themselves, who found yet again God intervening miraculously to protect his people as he was leading them to the land that he promised them.
So in conclusion, and certainly not dismissing the story, what do you think we can learn from it for today?
I think we can learn that God is eager to speak, and that God speaks to us, as the New Testament says, in many times and many ways. And that God is so determined to get through to us and speak to us, he will use anything. Of course, it's much easier if we hear him at first time. If when we're praying and we hear him saying something, to respond to it. If we read something in his word and feel him challenging or encouraging us to do something out of that, to do it. But I think what I'm encouraged by is that when push comes to shove, God will even use a donkey to get his message through. Such is God's passion to reach out to us, for us to know him, to relate to him. God will use anything. And even today, God can still use anything to get through to us. The challenge to us is, are we going to be like Balaam, who's blind, or the donkey who sees?
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.